Sarah Trawczynski. First negative. Sarah Trawczynski. First negative. Sarah J.
I'm Grayson Smith, second negative. Hi, Grayson Smith, second negative. Thank you for judging. Hi, Grayson Smith, second negative. Thank you for judging. Grayson Smith, second negative. Thank you for judging. I'm Grayson Smith, second negative. Thank you for judging.
Before we all get started today, I think it might be helpful for both of the teams here if maybe the judges could like introduce themselves individually and maybe say a little bit about maybe what they want to see in the round or any past game experience. Maybe starting with you, Sam.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sam. I have a lot of experience in this league and in like college parliamentary debate. So, as such, I generally preference analytics over rhetoric. At the same time, that's not like a binary. I like to see both, but I value cogent argumentation and I like good impact weighing. And the less work you make me do, the more you'll like my decision. So try to be really clear in the rebuttals about how you want me to vote, like what framework you want me to use.
Like Sam, I'm reasonably experienced in debate, and I too will want to see both communication skills and critical thinking / argumentation skills. One big thing I want you guys to focus on, especially in the final rebuttals, but also in the earlier speeches as well, is clearly defined line-by-line argumentation. So clearly tagged answers to points. Tell me where on the flow you are. That'll make both of our lives easier and create impact as well.
Dr. Rackland, my son did debate for several years. He's coached debate, so I'm familiar with the term, most of the terms. Well, I'll just draft some of them, so if you're going to use some real technical stuff, better explain it. Engineer background, so looking for analytics, logic, good evidence to back up your point.
I'm Cindy Val, and I'm supposed to be Evan right now, but he's homesick, so sorry, there's one less alumni on the panel. So I like stock issues, but I don't like topicality. But if you run it, that's okay, I'll listen to you. And I agree with the others. I like clear tags. That helps me judge. And I do like good sportsmanship and politeness, but I don't need to say that to all of you. So,
Yvonne Weingartner, 6 or 7 year parent judge, definitely a stock issues judge. 4-point refutation will help me as well, so I can get everything on the floor.
I'm Margaret Freeland. I'm a team policy and speech alumni. And I'm also I look at stock issues. I'm an accountant, so I pay attention to the details. I'm looking to see signpost clearly, tag your arguments, make sure you're responding to things back and forth. And it's really nice when you don't just reiterate what you said before. Tell me something new that actually responds to what they responded to you.
I'm Shereen Sturtevant, second year debate parent. I'm not as familiar with all the sophisticated jargon that goes along with debate, but I do like clear tags and references across the flow so I can follow your arguments and why your side is better than the other.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Everyone knows that we live in a globalized world, that the cliche of globalization masks its true fragility. The stability of the global system is not an accident. Rather, it is dependent on perpetual maintenance from world powers like the United States. In fact, the global economy is tenuously linked through a series of choke points that facilitate billions of dollars of trade each and every year. And to be surrender the stability of the global system to chance. One of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca, which the United States currently has no ability to monitor. Because we believe that such blindness is irresponsible and that the United States must take an active leadership role in defending the stability of the global system, my partner Joe and I are resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reform its foreign military presence and form foreign military commitments. With that in mind, let's examine the current system through our background point. The background is at a Strait of Malacca. Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is one of the world's most important passageways. Only 1.7 miles wide at its widest point, the Strait of Malacca is the only passageway capable of facilitating global trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. 36% of global trade passes through the Strait of Malacca each and every year. With that, let's move on to the harm of the current system. The harm is that of surveillance flow amidst threats. Surveillance flow. Let's examine this with several subpoints. Starting off with the 8 point, that of surveillance lacking. Surveillance lacking. A 2012 report by the Fund for Peace said, quote, "The Malacca Strait has been notorious for pirate attacks, as well as for being a haven for belligerent non-state actors. Porous borders and poorly monitored ports allow these threats to infiltrate into the coastal nations. In this governmental blind spot, crimes flourish." Unquote. Now, there are two very imminent threats that currently face the Strait of Malacca, and we'll explore these in our next two subpoints. Subpoint B is that of terrorist threat. Terrorist threat. Andre Rye of the Japan Institute for International Affairs described this threat in 2009 when he said, quote, "If a terrorist group hijacks a vessel and turns it into a floating time bomb to destroy one of the many ports or oil refineries along the Straits of Malacca, the effects will be catastrophic. The prospect of such a maritime incident is not remote. Maritime terrorism in Southeast Asia, and in particular the Straits of Malacca, must no longer be considered a question of if, but rather of when and where." Unquote. Now, the United States cannot idly survive when hostile terrorist organizations get ready to strike. And this is exactly what we are doing. The threat of terrorism is not remote, and in the current system, we leave all of our security up to chance. Now let's explore the next threat, for subpoint C, threat from China. Threat from China. In 2012, Dan Blumenthal of the American Enterprise Institute said, quote, "Given China's current military trajectory, it is prudent to expect that China will seek capabilities that both deny U.S. access to areas within the Western Pacific and pose a credible conventional threat to the United States homeland. China will also probably seek a measure of control in the Indian Ocean and around the Straits of Malacca." China's aggression is very threatening. Furthermore, China's goal to control the Strait of Malacca is an unacceptable threat. And in addition to China's behavior, Iran has also started sailing its 24th fleet of warships through the strait in recent months. This international hotspot is currently facing unprecedented hazard. Now, the United States needs to realize that the Strait of Malacca is a critical choke point and that it is more than capable of bringing the global economy to its knees. Yet Iran, China, and international terrorist organizations are all looking to control it. Yet America is sitting on the sidelines with a blindfold on, without the ability to even monitor the strait. Thus, we present the following plan. Mandate number 1, the Australian commitment. The Australian commitment. The United States will accept Australia's plan for upgrading the Cocos Islands areas. Mandate 2, establish air presence. Establish air presence over the Malaccan Strait. The Department of Defense will deploy 4 Northrop Grumman Global Hawk RQ-4 surveillance drones to be based on the Cocos Islands and monitor the Malaccan Strait. Our funding, as normal, meets the Department of Defense budget, and estimated costs are around $100 million to upgrade the base. All other unforeseen costs will also come from the Department of Defense budget. The timeline is immediately upon the affirmative ballot, and our enforcement is the United States federal government, the Department of Defense, and all other necessary branches of government. With that in mind, let's move on to the solvency that our plan creates. The solvency is surveillance mechanisms created. Surveillance created. According to Alan DuPont of the University of New South Wales on March 29, 2012, he says, quote, "The Cocos Islands will be very useful because they are much closer to Singapore and to the strategically important Malacca Strait than they are to Australia. It would give much better surveillance coverage of that really critical area." Unquote. With that established, let's move on to the advantage that our plan promotes. The advantage is that of U.S. power projection. U.S. power projection. By creating a strategic partnership with Australia to utilize the Cocos Islands for surveillance of the Malacca Strait, the plan allows the United States to power project in this really critical area to deter the imminent threats that exist there. In 2012, the U.S. Air Force then demonstrated that surveillance capabilities facilitate power projection. It read, quote, "Surveillance capabilities support power projection into anti-access area-denial environments, monitor weapons of mass destruction, support arms control, and defend our homeland," unquote. Now, the ability to power project into the Straits of Malacca creates two important impacts. The first of which, impact one, is sustained American influence. Sustained American influence. A 2012 paper by two four-star U.S. generals explained what will happen if the United States can no longer power project into the critical choke points like the Strait of Malacca. It read, quote, "America's adversaries today are embracing a strategy of access denial to counter America's power projection. If this process continues, U.S. political influence will recede. Aggression against our allies and partners will become more likely, and U.S. national power will degrade as our alliances weaken. In maritime choke points like the Straits of Malacca, adversaries can attempt to deny access with short-range missiles, integrated air defense, fast-attack boats, and tanks." Now, the second impact is that of global economic disruption prevented. The global economy is increasingly vulnerable to disruption to the Strait of Malacca. The same four-star journals heard previously went on to describe the United States must be able to prevent such a disruption from ever occurring. It read, quote, 90% of global trade travels by sea, and 25% of that travels to the Straits of Malacca. This interconnectedness makes the global economy susceptible to disruption. The fragility of choke points enable an increasing number of state and non-state actors to disrupt the global economy with a small number of well-placed precise attacks. The United States must be prepared to respond to these contingencies and to defend U.S. interests abroad and to preserve the freedom and security of the global commons in this rapidly changing environment. And today, we as Americans face a choice. We can turn a blind eye to the world, and we can hope that very real threats do not materialize. And we can watch the slow, painful decline of American leadership. Or we can take the prudent action to maintain global stability. We can monitor and project power into the world's hotspots to deter and defeat threats. And we can guarantee that strong American leadership will ensure the stability of the global system into the future. And that choice is yours. Thank you.
Hey Sarah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Are you ready for a couple questions? First of all, can you get a copy of the case?
That's definitely.
Right.
Here's a copy of the case, and then here's a copy of the specifics of the specifications of the drugs.
Okay, congratulations on your findings.
Yeah, you too.
All right, let's jump right into a somewhat B of the terrorist threat. Now, how long has the threat of a terrorist attack in the Strait of Malacca been an issue?
It's been an issue. Basically, it's never gotten this big before.
Okay, your evidence was in 2009, right?
Yes.
Okay, so 4 years ago, it was the biggest it's ever been.
No, it says it's not a question of when it happens. It's a question of, it's not a question of if it happens, but it's a question of
Okay, so when will it happen? If it didn't happen in 2009, 4 years ago, why would it happen now?
Just because it's never happened in the past doesn't mean we shouldn't take the necessary precautions to defend our homeland.
All right, well, we'll be addressing that in the next page. Let's turn down actually straight to your plan of the Australian Union and the air presence. A couple of questions here. One, you said that you used $100 million to upgrade the Australian bases. Is this to facilitate the drones?
Correct.
Okay, how long will it take to upgrade these bases?
This is two things. First off, the drones can already launch off the airbase currently. But in order to really maximize their productivity, we're going to upgrade it.
Okay, so a couple of questions actually about these global hawks. One, how many drones do you deploy over the Straits of Malacca?
We deploy 4 Norfolk Grumman global hawk RQ-4 drones.
Okay, secondly, how much do each of these drones cost?
We currently have them in our stockpile, so we don't have to purchase the drones. We have around 25 of these currently sitting in our stockpile. That's what we're going to use it early.
Okay, so the U.S. military currently has 25 of these drones, and you take 4 of them away, right? Okay, thanks. And are you assuming that the government wouldn't try and rebuild these? Will take some new drones and build the new drones post-plan?
Can you rephrase the question?
Do you believe that post-plan, the government and the military would assemble 4 new Global Hawk drones to replace the ones that you take from the stockpile?
They might. We're just using the drones that are available.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Let's actually turn down to your surveillance created. How quick is the United States response time when it comes to the Straits of Malacca? Do we have any fleets near there?
Yeah, we have the 7th Fleet, which is located in Japan. And then more importantly, we have basing in Singapore.
Okay, how close is Japan's 7th Fleet, which is, I'm assuming is the main one, to the Straits of Malacca?
We have exact response time back at the table, so it's made into a question. Okay. I don't know off the top of my head how quick the Navy ships could get to the Strait of Malacca.
All right, thanks. Now, your advantage to your impact too is that the global economic disasters avoided by your plan. There's a couple questions here. One, does China want the economy to be destroyed? The world economy to be destroyed?
China is not looking to cut off trade in the United States. What China wants is they want to exert their influence on the rest of the world, so they could basically deny our military.
What could China do?
They could deny our military access. They could, more importantly, they could influence their region.
Since when is the United States military getting involved in the Straits of Malacca?
Actually, our military passes through our military needs to be able to pass through the conflict wherever to occur in North Korea, South Korea.
Right.
That's
one final question: the Salton Sea Surveillance Strait, was this evidence specific to the Global Hawk Northern Trunk?
The specifics, I don't believe so.
Okay, thanks. No further questions.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, Charles.
Judges ready? And the timer. The affirmative team would have you believe that after they pass their plan, all the problems will be solved, that the problems in the status quo won't be there anymore. What I'm going to be focusing on in my speech is that the supposed problems in the status quo will actually be increased as a result of the affirmative plan. I'm going to go into a couple case responses, but then looking at the disadvantages of the affirmative plan, how the affirmative plan will actually make more problems come about. First off, let's talk about their harm, about how surveillance is low. I have one response. My response is of satellites. Now, the United States does have satellites hovering over the Strait of Malacca, so we can see into the Strait of Malacca, and we are able to monitor this site. So we are seeing into it. We do have a protection system. My partner will be talking more in his speech about how we do have enough protection. Well, now let's go into their mandate. 93 overall responses to their mandate, specifically about the Global Hawk drone. My first response is of $200 million. $200 million to buy one Global Hawk Hawk drone costs $200 million. Let's look at a piece of evidence from, actually I left the evidence back at the table, so my partner will read that in their speech. But pretty much the Affirmative team mandates $100 million for their 4 drones. It costs $200 million to buy 1 drone, and the Affirmative team is mandating 4. This means that they can have nearly enough funding in order for their plan to actually be passed. Let's go into my second response, which is a response time. Now we need to see a piece of evidence from the Affirmative team saying that the response time of these drones in order to respond to a threat would actually be quick enough, that we would actually have the time to get rid of a threat that would be coming towards the Malacca Strait. My third response is of an advocate. Now I would challenge the Affirmative team to bring up an advocate for the Global Hawk drone hovering over the Malacca Strait. Until we can see an advocate, we can't actually know if this is actually a good plan, specifically with the Global Hawk drone. Now let's go into the disadvantages of the Affirmative team's plan and negative repercussions that will result from this policy. The first disadvantage is of tension with China. I have 2 subpoints. My first subpoint is of the importance of the strait. The Malacca Strait is actually very important to China. Let's look at a couple pieces of evidence. The first piece of evidence is from Robert Potter, who's a visiting scholar at Columbia University, September 2012. Quote, the vast majority of China's oil imports pass through the straits of Malacca, Lombok, and Sunda. This creates a security issue for China, as the straits function as a strategic choke point through which China's energy supply must pass. Essentially, whoever controls the Straits of Malacca has the ability to heavily disrupt a vital energy corridor to China. The government of China is no doubt acutely aware of its energy dependence and the vulnerability of the supply, end quote. Now what this is saying is that the Strait of Malacca is extremely important to China, and they know that they have made themselves vulnerable in making this very important to them. So they are very vulnerable to the influence that other countries have on this. Let's go into another piece of evidence specific to how much China's trade actually goes through these straits, which is 85%. From the Fund for Peace, an independent nonprofit research organization, post-June 2012. Quote, as the second largest energy consumer in the world, China depends on the Malacca Strait for 85% of its imports. Wary of a minimized regional presence, China has rejected greater Indian and Japanese security involvement, going as far as rejecting propositions for security patrols from Japan, end quote. Now, what both of those pieces of evidence are saying is that China is very dependent upon the Malacca Strait for a lot of their trade, mostly oil, and that they are very sensitive to the involvement that other countries have within this strait. What does the United States do? The United States puts themselves in a very heavily involved situation with the Malacca Strait. That's my subpoint B, which is of U.S. involvement, United States involvement. Now, by involving the United States more with this strait, China is going to feel threatened by the United States. They're going to be thinking that the United States is trying to encroach on their sphere of influence. Because as the Affirmative team was stating in their case, China knows that a lot of their influence is placed into this strait. When another country comes in and starts putting a lot of involvement in that strait, then China will know that this is going to be an encroachment on their sphere of influence and that the United States will be a danger to that. The Affirmative team's plan is also putting the United States in a place where they have control over something that is very important to China, because that's part of the point of the Affirmative team's plan, which is having more control over China. China is going to see that the United States is putting themselves in a place where they're going to have a lot of control over them because 85% of their trade passes through there. China is not going to like it. They're going to become aggravated, and it will lead to increased tensions and increased risk of conflict. That's the impact, increased risk of conflict. Now, as everyone knows, China and the United States have a shaky relationship. They have a good relationship, but it has very much tension inside it. The United States encroaching on their sphere of influence will greatly increase the tensions and increase the risk of conflict between China and the United States, which far outweighs anything that the Affirmative has offered as an advantage with their plan. Because if the United States and China were to get into a military conflict of any kind, it would be very devastating for both China, the United States, and the world at large. Let's go to the disadvantage to increased terrorism. Now, the Affirmative would have you believe that under their plan, terrorism would decrease, but that is actually false. The subpoint A, or the reason why this will come about, is the U.S. presence. Now, by the United States involving themselves more in the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Malacca will actually be more attractive for the terrorists, because the terrorists want to attack the United States. So once the United States gets themselves involved more, the terrorists will incentive to attack the Strait. There are two reasons for this. The first is that pretty much all terrorists hate the United States, and so they would all like the opportunity to attack them. But why? The second reason is that it would gain them influence and it would gain them respect and fear throughout the world. If the terrorists were to make another successful attack against the United States, they would gain fear and respect throughout the world, which is what they're aiming for and which is what they want as a terrorist organization. Let's look at a piece of evidence from the Standard Journal of International Relations, spring 2009. Quote, in the case of the Malacca Strait, Indonesia and Malaysia fear that the threat of maritime terrorism may prove a sufficient impetus for foreign intervention. There is a fear that a strong U.S. presence may only bolster the ideological appeal of extremist elements and encourage terrorist attacks. End quote. Now, what this piece of evidence is saying is that if the United States actually increases their involvement and their influence in the Malacca Strait, the terrorists will actually have more incentive and more of a want to go into the Malacca Straits and to attack them. So the threat of a terrorist attack is actually increased under the affirmative team's plan. So what we can see is that the problems in the status quo will only be exacerbated. My partner is going to be talking about how specifically the problems for the affirmative team's plan don't actually exist. But I would ask you to focus on the disadvantages and see that there would be an increased risk of conflict with China, which would result in many repercussions, and that terrorism would actually be increased under the affirmative team's plan. And those both far outweigh any of the advantages and harms that the affirmative team has brought up in their case. Thank you. In space. Okay, so how would an imaging system from space be able to see terrorist activity on the ground? Sure, well, we put satellites in space for the purpose of being able to see things on the ground, so obviously we would be able to see the terrorist activity. Okay, interesting. My partner just said in the next speech. Now let's talk specifically about your third response to our mandate at a Planet Africa. Yes. Now you said that the sovereignty that we read in our speech, what is number 5? Well, what I want to see is specifically that putting the Global Hawk drones by the Strait of Malacca for the purpose of getting rid of the threat from China or Iran or terrorists would be a good idea. Okay, great. Now, under the first disadvantage of China, you kind of help us up here. Let me just ask a line question. So my first question is China currently aggressive in the status quo? In the Malacca Strait? Just overall, is China aggressive towards the United States? Well, they are aggressive in competition with the United States to become a world superpower, and they are competing with the United States for that and for the influence. But the recent evidence specifically read said that the country that gains control over the strait has more power, correct? Pretty much, yeah. So is it your stance the United States should just back out and not stay in a situation when China could definitely take control of the strait and have a large advantage over us? Well, my partner is actually going to be presenting a speech why China would not be doing that. But what I'm saying is that if the U.S. were to intervene and increase their involvement and influence, it would actually make the problems worse. So, did you respond to the harm piece of evidence, someone see that specifically stated that it's China's current goal to securitize the strait and to seek control over the strait? Yes, my partner is going to be responding to this in his speech. Okay, great. I'll talk a little bit about actually going on with China's disadvantage. Now, when we put missile defense recently in Japan and in South Korea, how did China respond to that? I'm not exactly sure, but missile defense isn't an offensive threat against the country. So how is surveillance an offensive threat against the country? Oh, what I'm specifically talking about here is that the strait is extremely important to China, and as you were saying, it's a sector of great influence for them. Would you agree that China's conventional force is also a great part of, very important to them? Their conventional army is important to them, of course. Since we're just surveying the strait, how would this, basically, I don't see the link of how we would suddenly tipping brain with China. Right, because as you were actually stating in your speech during cross-examination, China has a lot of influence into this strait, and 85% of their trade is in here. Great, my last question in this answer, sorry, is that of terrorism. How would terrorists shoot down a drone in the sky? Well, I'm have more of an incentive to attack you. My partner's going to be talking about your case specifically, so let me address this. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
All judges ready? Right. According to the official news agency of the country of Iran, quote, our Navy's 24th fleet of warships, comprised of the Salameh destroyer and the Kark helicopter carrier, is passing through the Strait of Malacca for the first time since the victory of our Islamic Revolution. That's according to their Rear Admiral Habibullah Siyar. He goes on and says, a constant and extensive presence of Iran in international waters will be on the top of our Navy's agenda, unquote. It's because of threats like these from Iran and also the threats from terrorists, pirates, and China that we've really asked you to vote for the affirmative team's plan for surveillance and security at the end of this round. Now, the negative team brought up a couple disadvantages and cage responses in their last speech. I'm going to be responding to those and showing you how our plan increases the security of the United States, protects from these imminent threats, which is really what we should be doing at the end of the round. Let's start with their first point of satellites. Two responses, no evidence. Michaela just came up and stated that the U.S. has satellites that are totally effective at current surveillance. No evidence to support this claim whatsoever. In a team policy debate, you really need evidence to support your claims if you're going to make a claim like this. Second response is a different type of surveillance. A different type of surveillance. Now, satellites do have their place, and even if we had some, that's awesome, but they don't solve the specific type of surveillance we're talking about. We need surveillance that can identify each individual ship, what it's doing, and really what it could be doing down the road, and basically why it's there in the first place. That's what our global hawks specifically do. The problem with their argument is that basically these satellites are up in space. Now, that's great for taking nice green pictures of islands, but it's not really great for identifying what's going on each individual ship. Let's move on to their responses to the plan. Their first argument was about $200 billion for the cost of drones, and that we don't provide money for the cost of drones. Now, out of these evidence here, basically saying the drones are already in our current stockpile. Let me grab this real quick. Basically, we don't need to pay for the drones, we already have them. According to Reuters News, April 1st, 2013, quote, today the Pentagon possesses roughly 25 global hawks, around 20 in the Air Force and the balance in the Navy. And the fleet is slated to expand to more than 100 by the late 2020s, unquote. So basically, we already have the drones, we've got 25, we just take 4 of them, and we're all good because we don't need any funding, we've already built these drones. Let's move on to their next point of the drone response time. They said, how long will it take for the drones to respond? My response is the ships respond. The ships respond. Now let me explain what the current situation is like. We currently have a large basing in Singapore, which is right on the Strait of Malacca, and we also have the U.S. 7th Naval Fleet patrolling the East Asia and the areas around Indonesia. The problem is that these ships currently are blind. There's no surveillance for these ships to really see what's going on and to preempt problems before they arise. That's what our plan does. We give the ships basically the eyes. We unblind the ships so that they're able to respond effectively in a time of crisis. Say a terrorist gets a nuclear weapon on a ship somehow, and we need to respond to that in a timely fashion. What we could do is we could use these ships, because we have the surveillance, the ships would now be made effective, basically. Otherwise, the ships are not effective without the surveillance. So the ships provide the response time, and that's what is really important about our plan, providing the surveillance for the ships. Let's move on to the disadvantage of tension with China. I have 3 overall responses. But first of all, I'd like to agree with a lot of what they said. The Strait of Malacca is very important to China, and China's economy is very important to China as well. However, unfortunately for the negative, this simply goes to prove our point that China is currently moving into the Strait of Malacca, trying to gain as much influence and as much leverage in that area as possible. Basically, China wants a power grab in the Strait of Malacca. Let's move into actually I have 4 responses to this disadvantage. My first response is unrealistic scenario. Unrealistic scenario. Basically, Michaela stated that tensions will rise and then all of a sudden, oh, there's a risk of conflict. Well, this isn't really going to happen. The United States has been putting a lot of stuff in this region recently. We put a bunch of missile defense in Japan just a few months ago based on the North Korea threats, and then we've also been selling weapons to countries like the Philippines and Taiwan. China didn't declare war over this. Now, this is the same thing with our plan. China's not going to declare war over this. Let's move on to my second point, that China's already moving in. China's already moving in. And the negative team really didn't respond to our argument that China is currently moving into the Strait of Malacca and exerting influence and power there. Basically, China is looking to control this area. Now, why is that bad? Let's look into my third response. China control bad. China control bad. Basically, the Strait of Malacca should be international waters. It's an international place. One country controlling that creates problems. Let's look at some evidence. This is from Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Spinetta, U.S. Army. He says that, quote, China's breakneck military buildup has given it the capability to increasingly threaten its neighbors and U.S. regional influence. The United States needs to be prepared for the contingency that China follows a less than friendly path. Failure to respond to China threatens U.S. power projection capability, and surrendering maritime control to China would effectively give it a vote in U.S. foreign policy. For example, a naval battle group proceeding from Japan to the Middle East, forced to sail around Australia, would require an additional 15 days of transit. The extra fuel costs alone would amount to almost $10 million. More critical than the monetary cost, the loss of speed and responsiveness may prove difficult to overcome. If China succeeds in gaining control of the strait, then half of the world's merchant fleet would be required to seek alternate routes. Now that's if they blocked off the access to the strait. This situation would result in huge economic losses, unquote. Basically, China controlling the strait gives them two things. First of all, they get total leverage over basically the entire world's economy, and because of this world's shipping lane. It's a critical component of the world's economy, and one nation having the control over that creates a ton of problems. Secondly, I mentioned that ships would have to go around. Basically, ships going from the Middle East to East Asia would have to go all the way around Australia. That's because there's no other way for these big ships, huge ships, to really go through besides the Strait of Malacca. That's what the evidence said. Now, why is this bad? Well, we all know that North Korea and other countries like that have been making threats against the United States recently. Imagine a war breaking out between North Korea and South Korea, which is a very real possibility in the current system. The United States is bound to South Korea's defense by a treaty. So we would need to draw upon troops from the Middle East in order to make sure that conflict basically was quelled. And basically we put troops in defense of South Korea. Imagine our ships having to go all the way around Australia and losing 16 days and basically critical response time in order to respond to that crisis or any other crisis. This would be terrible for our security. My last response to this disadvantage is must deter. Must deter. According to Aaron Friedman, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, August 2011, quote, for as long as China continues to be governed as it's being governed today, its growing strength will pose a deepening challenge to American interests. If the U.S. wants to deter aggression and discourage coercion, we're going to have to work harder to maintain a favorable balance of regional power. Washington and Beijing are going to remain locked in an increasingly intense struggle for mastery, unquote. Basically, the only way to solve the problem of Chinese aggression is to deter them. If we give China an inch, they're going to take a mile. Any sign of weakness on the part of the United States is going to only make them more aggressive and more belligerent. In the end, we just have to put these drones in to show China that we actually have security interests and we're not going to stand for them running wild in the Strait of Malacca. The last disadvantage was about terrorism. My first response is surveillance deterrence. Surveillance deterrence. According to Michael Isherwood, Master's in Strategic Studies for the National War College, 2008, quote, a consequence of persistent awareness is the threat of detection can actually alter terrorist activities. This threat and corresponding terrorist attempts to avoid detection can be almost as profound as removing terrorists from the international scene, unquote. Basically, keeping monitoring activities on terrorists deters them from being in that region because they will see that there's this monitoring on this strait and they'll know that anything they do will be seen by the United States. This deters them from even going there in the first place, basically removes them from the international scene. Really at the end of the round, we'd ask you to vote for a plan not only because of the current threats that we face, but also because of China and terrorism. These are real threats that we're facing and they're specific threats. The U.S.'s security is not guaranteed, but it would be under an affirmative ballot. Monitoring is necessary. Thank you very much. Pretty good, Michaela. Congrats on the finals.
Thank you, you too. I'm just going into a few questions about your speech. First off, can I see a piece of evidence about how drones are installed?
Yeah. Sorry, not current, it's actually drones.
And did you bring up a specific piece of evidence saying about how this is the same drone, or about how it will be enough, or that it is what we're going to be using for your plan?
Yep, those are the type of drones we're using for our plan.
Okay, thank you. Now moving on, did you bring up a piece of evidence that the ship response time, which was your response, would be quick enough to respond to a threat?
Yeah, I did. Or basically, I actually just lied. Given the fact that Singapore is right on the Strait of Malacca, they're already right there in Memphis.
So you're saying that
They're as close as they could possibly be.
Right. Did you bring up a piece of evidence about how the response time would specifically be enough?
No, because we can see the threat before it actually occurs. And then once we see the threat, we can send the ships that are already right there, basically to solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving on, does China want the United States more involved in exerting more influence in the Malacca Straits?
What China wants is the ability to run wild in the Strait of Malacca and other places in that region. And really, voting for the status quo in the current system gives them the ability to do that.
Right, so since China does want all of the control and all the influence in the Strait of Malacca, would they want the United States to be exerting more influence there?
I'm not saying that China would like our plan. I'm saying that our plan effectively deters the threats from China. Basically, it keeps the situation peaceful instead of increasing China's aggression and belligerence.
Okay, right, so you're saying you will deter China specifically from going to the Straits of Malacca, but how is it going to deter China from the increased risk of conflict and the tensions in our relationship?
Well, I gave the example of all the stuff we're doing currently. For instance, we put a bunch of missile defense in Japan. Now, hypothetically, under your argument, that would really increase the risk of conflict with China. However, we haven't seen any of those repercussions from our current policies, so there's no reason to believe we can make the jump from 4 drones to really war with China.
Right, thank you. Now, you made the response to my disadvantage about increased terrorism that we are going to deter them from going in at all, correct?
That's correct.
All right, how exactly will that happen?
Because they know that the U.S. is monitoring every ship and every activity that's going on in the Strait of Malacca. If a terrorist wanted to do a terrorist attack, it would not be put in a place where there is total surveillance by the United States.
So the terrorists will not go into the Strait of Malacca because they think that they might be seen?
They might be seen and then their plot would be foiled, basically.
Okay, if you can prove that there is much surveillance and protection in the Strait of Malacca, and that there are still terrorists trying to get in, would that prove that this response is really bad?
It depends on the argument.
Okay, thank you for the questions.
All right. Judges ready? Right now. Number 2. We go. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn once said, "Until the possible becomes actual, it's only a distraction." The problem with the affirmative plans is that the threats they outline and the advantages they claim are only possible, not actual. They may sound legitimate in theory, but in reality, they simply don't play out. That's mainly what we'll be looking at in this speech: is the affirmative case, their harms and advantages, and then 2 salty points proving that the affirmative doubt isn't justified. Let's start with their harm of surveillance alone. Now, Michaela's have wonderful lots of satellites. However, I'm going to have several more responses detailing our position here. My first general response to the harm is that of current protection. Recently, the United States is actually been upping and increasing, along with other countries, the protection in the Straits of Malacca. Interpress Service reporting about an interview of Patricia O'Brien, who's the UN Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs. In 2012, August, quote, "The Malacca Straits Patrol is comprised of Malacca Strait Sea Patrol, the Eyes and Sky Air Patrols, and the Intelligence Exchange Group, which are a set of practical cooperative measures to ensure the security of the Straits of Malacca. This arrangement entails conducting coordinated naval and air patrols while facilitating the sharing of information between ships and the monitoring agency. This is a very sophisticated system which has allowed the number of piracy attacks in the Malacca Strait to drop from 38 reported incidents in 2004 to none in 2011, unquote. So essentially, we put this new system in there with very sophisticated satellite, this actually surveillance and patrolling of the situation. The piracy attacks were actually 38 in 2004, none in 2011. Peter Chalk, senior analyst at the Rand Corporation and PhD in political science, in April 2010, quote, "The threat of an attack strike appears very low. The waterway is well guarded, and there's currently no group in the immediate region with the necessary skills or motivation to conduct decisive operations against maritime assets," unquote. So the terrorist threat is low in the current system. Let's address now the specific arguments. First of all, that of terrorists. I have 3 responses. First, efforts focused elsewhere. In the current system, the terrorist efforts aren't in a random Strait of Malacca. There are countries like Pakistan and Yemen, and actually Iraq and Afghanistan. Several countries where terrorist strikes are actually happening. The affirmative team has read evidence in 2009 all they want, but they haven't proven a current threat of terrorists. Terrorist threats are actually focused elsewhere in the current system. My second response is no hijacking. No hijacking. The essential argument by the affirmative team is that they can be hijacked. However, this hasn't happened recently. and there's really no reason for it to happen in the future. Michael Kelsa, Air Force Major General, said in August 2012, quote, "A decade ago, the Strait of Malacca was a dangerous place. Today, incidents have dropped to fewer than 5 a year without a single successful hijacking in almost 5 years." In almost 5 years, there's not been a single successful hijacking of any of the Straits of Malacca. This harm by the authorities is unfounded. Moving to the subpoint B of China, or subpoint C rather of China, my response is counterproductive for China. Counterproductive for China. Any move to actually affect the Straits of Malacca negatively would be very counterproductive for China, given, as the evidence in the 1AC stated, 85% of their imports go through the Strait of Malacca. Let's refer to the subpoint, well, I kind of call it subpoint D, but they're really mainly just mentioning in passing in the 1AC, and then talked about more of the 2AC, that of Iran. I have 3 responses. First, China solves. China solves. In the current system, China has influence over Iran, and given China doesn't want the Straits of Malacca closed, they solve the threat of Iran. Second response, oil. Iran's economy is very dependent on oil, and guess what? A lot of oil travels through the Straits of Malacca. Closing off the straits would actually be bad for Iran and hurt their economy. My third response is history denies. History denies. A couple of years ago, Iran actually tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States 5th Fleet was able to deter them from doing so. The affirmative talks all about how the 7th Fleet is ready. Well, guess what? The 7th Fleet can deter Iran from the Straits of Malacca, just like the 5th Fleet did deter them from the Straits of Hormuz. Before moving to my solvency points, let's quickly jump to their advantage. Under their impact number 2 of the economic devastation prevented, I have 2 responses. Firstly, reroute. Reroute. Now, in the issue of Malacca with Indonesia and Singapore, there is a chain of islands. Now, the affirmative has made the assertion that if trade were continued, it would have to go all the way around Australia. However, geographically, this doesn't make any sense. There are obviously other routes that they could go. The affirmative is sent to say that there's one route that goes from one country to another, and that if they can't go through that route, they have to go all the way around. That doesn't make sense. My second response is reopen. Reopen. A couple of years ago, the Strait of Hormuz was closed, and guess what? It was reopened within a couple of days. Same situation with Malacca. Let's now turn to my 2 solvency points, proving that the affirmative plan simply can't happen and won't work. Solvency one is that of sovereignty. Sovereignty. The fact is that in order for the affirmative team to use their plan, they need the permission of 3 countries. Let's actually take a look at that in my 2 subpoints. Subpoint A is that if UN law prohibits. UN law prohibits. According to the International Journal of Humanitarian and Social Sciences, in January 2012, quote, according to Article 3 of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, awards state sovereignty over territorial seas, which extends 12 nautical miles off a state's coast. The Malaccan Strait falls within the jurisdiction of the coastal states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Unquote. The affirmative team needs the permission of these countries to do their plan. There are 2 problems here. One, the affirmative hasn't proven that the countries will accept their plan. But let's turn to subpoint B. The states won't accept. Stanford Journal of International Relations said in 2009, quote, the largest obstacle to maritime state involvement is the reluctance of literal states to surrender any control over their territory. Poor reception highlights the sovereignty concerns of coastal states and their connection to anti-American sentiment from aggressive U.S. policy elsewhere. Literal states vehemently reject the notion of other states controlling their territorial waters. Unquote. So essentially, this article is actually about the Malacca Strait. Essentially, these 3 countries, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, need the approval of. They need to get the government approval in order to do the plan, but the affirmative hasn't proven it, and these countries historically have not given the United States permission. The affirmative plan would actually violate international law if they would go through with it and actually